Thank you all for coming. My name is Miljenka Buljević, and I will be having a conversation about the book Lost in Media with my guests today. I will begin with the only man at the table, ISMAIL, a journalist from the UK but of Somali origin. ISMAIL covers the topics of refugees, migrants and human rights, and his work has been published by The Guardian, The Nation, Foreign Policy, New York Times, just to mention a few. ISMAIL, welcome. He is the editor of the book Lost in Media. With us today is NADIFA Mohamed, a writer from the UK but also of Somali origin. NADIFA has already been to Bookstan, and her work is known to the local audience as well in translation. The Black Mamba Boy and Orchard of Lost Souls. She has written essays and short stories as well, and her work deals with the colonial past, personal histories, and identity and conflict. And our third guest today is Antonija LETINIĆ from the neighboring Croatia. Antonija is an editor and a person who has been engaged with non-profit media in Croatia, both as the editor of a media and as a programmer of media literacy programs. Both NADIFA and Antonija feature in the book. NADIFA has an interview with Alexander Hammond, and Antonija wrote about the media landscape in the Balkans. I will give the microphone now to ISMAIL and ask ISMAIL to tell us briefly about the context of the book, how it came about. We just saw the video clip, and just to tell us a bit about what we are talking today.
Well, thank you so much, Mika, for the introduction. Good afternoon. Thank you to Bookstan for having us, to the European Cultural Foundation for bringing us here, to Antonija and NADIFA, both contributors to this volume, Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives and the Public Sphere. You can see copies at the front. It's now published and available, published by Vallis in the Netherlands. So I'll just do a brief summary of the book and its content and contributors. So as Mika was saying, Lost in Media is conceived from Displaced in Media, which we just saw a short film from. And it's a project that was created in cooperation with the European Cultural Foundation. And this book comes out of that process, and actually Antonija was also involved in Displaced in Media. So Lost in Media is a collection of essays that looks at how migrants or people of migrant background are represented throughout the European media. It has 9 essays, 2 are interviews. One is a conversation between Alexander Hammond and NADIFA Mohamed. And the rest are essays, and they are by leading artists, authors and journalists. And briefly, I just want to go through the book just a little bit in terms of the premise of the book. So ever since the migrant crisis hit the headlines, which we'd all be very familiar with, since we saw the images of Alan Kurdi, the young Kurdish boy washed up on a beach in Turkey, and the tragic sinking of the coast of Lampedusa, in 2014. The stories of migrants and how migrants are represented throughout the European media have been much more to the front and have been contested. But the reality is that if migrants appear in the media coverage, they are represented as characters in other people's stories or as something other. Migrants are portrayed usually in very simple binaries. Between being a threat or being as a victims. They never appear as fully formed human stories. They tend to appear as statistics. And the reality is migrants may have entered European societies, particularly since the so-called crisis, from 2015, but their perspectives have been consistently denied and ignored. So this volume, Lost in Media, is really an attempt to reframe the boundaries of the public sphere that include the stories of migration, but also to illuminate the realities that we see of contemporary Europe. And the contention, or what we're trying to do hopefully in this collection, but also that Displacing Media project was trying to do, is to say if Europe is to deal with the many problems that it has, and if migrants and refugees are to become fully recognized citizens of this continent, they need to be participants in rather than subjects of public debate. And I won't go too much into mentioning some of the many fantastic contributions, but just a few. I'll begin with obviously our two fantastic contributors here. Briefly, NADIFA Mohamed and Alexander Hemon, who have a conversation about what it means to be displaced, on violence, on community, and telling stories of trauma, both as authors of fiction, but also as essayists and as thinkers. It's a really fantastic read. Very kindly, Literature Hub, LitHub, have republished an excerpt of that interview, that conversation rather. So you can read that and it's available, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that later on with NADIFA. And the second essay is from Antonija, who, as Mika was saying, wrote about the Balkan context, which of course is very relevant being here in Sarajevo. And Antonija will talk more about that. And finally, just two brief other examples which illuminate the kind of what you may get if you buy this copy. One is a really moving piece from Ece Temelkuran, the Turkish writer, who writes about the experience of what it means to be designated, given the designation exile. So we all know, because she's based in Zagreb, about her situation. She's very well known, renowned for her writing. Her situation is much more comfortable than, say, a young Gambian kid from Gambia who's in Sicily, sort of people I intend to interview in my work as a journalist. But nonetheless, she's still dealing with this issue of this label of exile, and she writes a very moving essay at the end of the collection. And the other two brief pieces I'll mention is one by Nazreen Malik, who's a columnist of The Guardian, who writes about the idea of humanizing stories, and migrants stories particularly. The idea of migrants, should be represented as good, as virtuous, in order for us to feel, empathy and therefore to care about, the situation at Europe's borders. And finally, Daniel Trilling, who is an author who's known for his writing on the subject, who writes a really brilliant piece which deals with the uncomfortable reality of the present situation in terms of the media coverage of migrants. And he does a little sort of survey, really, of the last sort of 5 years of the coverage. So please buy the book. Thank you for having us, and we'll talk more about it.
Thank you, Ismail. I will begin from the beginning. Antonija, I have a question for you. Just to tell us a bit about the media landscape that we are dealing with now. It has changed in the past maybe 15 years, because the media as we know them are on decline. And also there is a upsurge of new media, and especially digital media, that are taking over certain functions. So I'm not putting a value judgment on either or. I would like you to tell us a bit about the media context that we are now in.
Well, I wouldn't like to put any kind of judgment neither. To me, it was very interesting to look in the past several years, the great surge of fact-checking media. When I entered the media field and I was getting acquainted with it, the fact-checking was kind of beginning of the journalism. Now we have more and more media outlets that are specialized for fact-checking. Not only that media are specialized for fact-checking, but they're even licensed to be proved fact-checkers. So the bizarrity or the chaos that the media's landscape is confronting is pretty tremendous, and it's pretty complex to see where this kind of dissolution is going, where it's leading us. The internet was always kind of blamed for this dissolution of relevance and the ability for everyone to use the media, to produce the media, to to take the voice of a journalist or whatever. And some authors, some theorists argued that it actually started with the 80s and with the commodification of the production of the news, and that the internet only helped accelerate this process and offered tools that allowed democratization of media. And I think that in that sense, democratization is something that we should look forward to, and that this dissipation is at the moment not comfortable and it's freaking us out, but that in the future we will see new reorganization and new structures that will really maybe offer some other kind of communication. And because I think we have to regard both layers, the content-wise and the technological aspect of the media, because they're codependent or interdependent, and we don't know how it will reframe in the next technological and political influences that are to come, because we don't know how the societies will be organized. So I think that it's very much, when we discuss about migrations and refugees and representation, it's based on the nation states. We have nation states and official culture, official politics, official religion, official ethnicity, and then the ones who don't belong to the box, they are the refugees, migrants, others, whatever. And I think that the future will bring us different social configurations, and that they will reflect in media too. Another thing I think it's important is how we will organize information exchange. So media started growing in the way that we regard it now, somewhere in the late 18th, beginning of the 19th century. But before that, spaces of information exchange, of discussion, were happening in different ways. So we can cry over media decline, but then there was a little note on an edition in 1938 saying that media were never so irrelevant and so incoherent and so incorrect. So this joke of a professor from comparative literature that states that the first writing man ever left is that before it was better. So I think it's the same with the media, you know, that we can cry over past times, but nothing from the past times is present now, so the media can't be either. And in that sense, for the media, to me, it seems important to think how to communicate, how to open discussion, how to open debate, and how to involve people in them. And independent or non-profit media are very important, playing very important role, for example, in Croatian context. We are actually too small of a territory, too small, like 4 million people, and the countries around us don't go much beyond that. And these kind of markets are too small to maintain quality, competitive, solid, healthy media landscapes. On the other hand, it allows for smaller outlets, which internet offered us, to grow, to appear, and to give a counter image. And the third thing, I think, it's that my generation of my niece and nephew, who are currently in a primary school, they're not using the media in a way that we used to use it. And they will probably never be the readers of daily newspapers, you know? And in that sense, we also have to see how to learn new languages and how to communicate with new generations who are using different language and maybe won't be dependent on this nation-state framework that is bringing us to the discussion why someone is displaced.
Thank you, Antonia. On that note, Ismail, we are still we are still in this media landscape that Antonia described. So there are old school news media, and then there are online, digital, progressive or regressive media. Then there are social media, and there are personal communications that are becoming a public space as well. So in all that mess, how are refugees, migrants, others represented? What is the main trope or main characteristic or feature that makes a coherent image of them in the public sphere?
Okay, well, I think as Antonia did very helpfully there, she sort of gave us the media landscape in terms of the decline that is happening because of digitization, because of the internet, which has brought certain democratization, but actually has also displaced the traditional structures that we used in terms of consuming media. And of course, this is a collection of essays that represents artists, thinkers, and journalists from across Europe. So, as you were saying, that there are differences in terms of the media landscape from Bosnia-Herzegovina to Croatia to the UK to Spain. So this might not necessarily be true for every nation, but nonetheless, when it comes to representations of migrant stories, migrant lives, migrant bodies, and so on, often the word is displaced. That's what happens in the mainstream media when it comes to the national broadcasters. In the UK, for example, we know from studies, we know from research that's been done. There's research that's been done from the Ethical Journalism Network on representation of migrants in the UK media with City University, which has a very good journalism program, and they found that routinely journalists who cover stories of migration in broadcast media particularly fail to tell the full story. They rely on certain tropes about migrants. There are cliches. There are kind of language and representation and framing within the broadcast media that creates this lens on migrant lives, which tends to lead to discrimination of them, both in the media but also at the society at large. And when it comes to other forms of media, whether it's in the print world, whether it's in the digital world, not just in the UK but across the European media, we see that all too often the media has failed to tell the full story from first-hand, contextualizing the full story. So if you were to read the newspapers from 2015, when Alan Kurdi washed up dead on a Turkish beach, or you saw the boat sinkings, or 2016, that year alone 5,000 people died crossing the seas of Europe. If you were to read the media coverage then, in the popular press, even in the local press, you would hear the sort of tropes and cliches, but also you would maybe think as a reader that there were floods, there were swarms, there were tons of people coming, but, Germany, for example, only took 1 million Syrian refugees in 2015. But the majority of refugees who are Syrian are in Lebanon. They're in Turkey. The majority of refugees from the Somalia conflict are in Kenya. The majority of refugees from South Sudan are in Uganda. They're in Ethiopia. The vast majority of migration in Africa, in the continent of Africa, according to the UN, 80% is intra-African. Yet we hear these tropes all the time repeated in the media, and they have a corrosive and dangerous effect. And the essays in the collection try and pick that apart. And just to come to the end, I think a really great essay that picks this apart is Nazreen Malik, who's known for writing about these issues. But she writes, for example, not just the need to humanize migrant refugee stories, but the insidious ways in which the media itself, the media fraternity, the editors, the copy editors, the commissioning editors, everybody really plays a role in creating this. And finally, I can speak most knowingly about the British media, but this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This lack of representation, this displacement, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in a vacuum because the media fraternity itself is not at all representative of all of us in the society. You know, if you look at the UK context, the vast majority of people who work in the print media are white, not just white, they are white from a particular background. They went to public school or private school in the UK. They went to Oxford or Cambridge University. So, you know, we have this issue of migrant refugee lives and stories being displaced, but also the people who could tell are also displaced. This could be second generation, third generation people of migrant background, say in the UK, they're displaced from the media. So there's a narrative being told about them, but they're not in this space to be able to tell their own narrative. And if they are in this space to tell some of those narratives, they're often put in a box, or they often face violence online and other realms.
Talking about the voice or the representation, NADIFA, you and Sasha in this book have a beautiful conversation about the agency of each one of us, and in my opinion, that the idea of agency that we have over our stories is the central idea of this book. So my question would be, who gets to tell the story and who has the right to tell the story, and why is this agency to tell the story of one's own so important?
Thank you. It's a huge question, and it instantly makes me think about History of Violence by Edouard Louis, the young French novelist. And he talks about who has the right or responsibility to talk about things such as sexual violence, or, you know, on a grander scale, political violence, communal violence. And in one interesting passage, despite him recounting his own traumatic experience of sexual violence, he asks the question of, why is it down to me? Why do I have to tell this story when I'm already so burdened? It should be the responsibility of all the people around me who either looked away or didn't help, or created the circumstances in which things like this could happen. The responsibility lies with them. And that made me think, because I often feel a discomfort of telling the stories of people who've experienced much more hardship or violence than I have. But at the same time, I'm either a descendant or intimately connected with them. So how can I sidestep this? How can I write, you know, stories about going to the shops, or romantic stories about living in London, when there's all of this background to tackle, all of these wounds to look at? So that's one of the chief reasons I write the stories that I write. And it's also a way of understanding where we are now. When I was writing my father's story in Black Mamba Boy, which was set primarily in the 1930s and 40s, the parallels were so obvious. They could not be ignored. So in the same way that people are crossing the Sahara to get to Europe now, they were doing that then. And my father had similar traumatic memories of having to leave people behind in the desert, because you either keep going or you die there. So they had to leave people behind. And of all of, I said it very in the prologue of the novel, that it's not just my father's story, it's all of this, it's also the story of all of those people who couldn't tell it themselves, who didn't live long enough to tell it. So I did feel that sense of burden, I guess. And now I think we're living in such strange, frenetic times that the history of all of this, again, feels very present. In Britain, we've got a very feral political environment, anti-immigrant, anti-Europe, anti-everything, a kind of a kamikaze type social culture at the moment. And there was an interesting documentary looking at the very first big wave of immigrants, the first swarm, the first flood of immigrants from the West Indies, who had a legal right. They were British citizens whether they liked it or not. You know, there were anti-colonial movements and they were suppressed, but the same people who were saying, okay, well, we're British, let's go live in Britain, they were also pushed back. And the British had to do this very strange thing where legally they had to accept that these people had a right to live and work in the UK, but they didn't want them. And they were trying to do all of these things behind the scenes, using very PC language to stop that flood of people coming in. And that culture has still remained over all of those decades. So that was 1948, and even now, those descendants of those individuals who came with the Windrush, they've been forcing people out, even though they've had a legal right to live in the country, deprived them of work, deprived them of medical care. Some of them have died without any recourse. So it's not surprising to me that we're in the state that we are now.
But now you mentioned that it has been going on almost forever, at least in the 20th century. But in the recent years with the refugee crisis, Antonia, you write about that the image that we received from the media was different than in 2015 than it is now. How has it changed the image of the migrants and the refugees, people crossing the Balkans? It has changed in the course of 4 years. How has it changed, and can you give us a bit the account of the first enthusiasm and then despair in a way that changed also with the political situation?
I would say that media were afraid of violence and that they actually behaved in a politically responsible way because it was a huge amount of people passing the border. And for example, in Croatia, in the 2015, in the fall, when there was a huge wave of people passing through the state, the media wanted to create this positive image on the international scene because the political the government at the time actually reacted very well to the situation, organized transportation, let people go. People were organizing themselves among themselves to transport people to avoid trafficking and these other different kinds of ways people were taking money out of refugees. And the media actually liked that image that they had to present, that they had a chance to present, and they used it. But when the wave like faded out, we also had a political change on the in the government, and the right wing took over, and they needed a kind of fire. They were pouring oil to the fire. So there was no immediate and imminent threat at the moment, and they needed to somehow escalate the tension. And I think that's the main reason why this change of representation, because they had to use the opportunity to create another enemy in a society, to maintain their political power there, and used media very well for that.
And we know that, Ismail, that when creating an enemy, you have to flatten it out. You have to simplify the enemy and boil it down to one and only one aspect or only one feature. And that's that has been a media method in a way in Europe predominantly to have only one side to the story. You were mentioning either having them as saints or victims, or having them as perpetrators and demonizing them. So my question would be, from this, from the text that you published in this book, what is to be done? How can we change the approach? Is there any way we can tackle that simplification in a more humane or responsible way in the media?
Well, I think that's a big question to answer. But before I maybe answer that last question, I'll just come back to a couple of things that NADIFA was saying and Antonia. One of the things that's really interesting is that, of course, 2015, we had the image of Alan Kurdi, and that was, the fall or the autumn, we say, of 2015, and it was all across the European media. Even in right-wing newspapers. I mean, the Sun newspaper in the UK ran that image on its cover, but said that image proved that the UK had to get involved in the attack in Syria, which was an interesting take. But nonetheless, throughout the media, that image was very important. And you could ask why that image became so pervasive in the media. And Daniel Trilling actually does quite a good job in explaining why that happened in his contribution. But nonetheless, that moment of empathy or understanding, if you can call it that, and you're right, there were these kind of welcome refugees and so on in the civil society all across Europe that was happening, and things quickly changed. I think history is an important lesson of that, because actually Europe hasn't been, it has been here before. Europe has a recent traumatic history of displacement of borders or people crossing borders, and the idea that Europe or European countries have been generous is somewhat misleading, because if you look at the context in which the conflicts are happening, the recent movement of people since 2015, the burden is really on the countries like Lebanon and Turkey. And in terms of the coverage of this simple binary that we see reflected in the coverage of the media, I mean, these essays are an attempt to try and dissect that through trying to understand the ways in which that works, the ways in which it hinders a more nuanced conversation. In terms of what to do, your last question, and how do we change this? Well, I think the Displacing Media Project and the European Cultural Foundation and others have been engaged in trying to create a different way of dealing with stories of people on the move, particularly when it comes within the journalism fraternity, within journalists. I primarily was a journalist who's working on issues of migration. There are a number of networks that are out there beyond Displacing Media. For example, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma is an excellent resource. There are resources there available to try and change the ways in which journalists themselves cover this issue. So going into the newsrooms, talking to reporters, talking to editors, and also talking to photographers, because images are really an important part of all of this. And often the images we get of people who are migrant refugees are very simple and often based on very regressive ideas about those people.
NADIFA, you have been involved with oral history for... apart from, not in the context of journalism, but I was wondering how can oral histories can add to the journalist representation of the others in general, but also of the refugees and migrants in this situation?
It's an interesting question because a lot of the oral history work that I do has been in Somaliland, so then you're talking to the people who either did leave and came back or the descendants of people who've stayed. I have done some work in Cardiff, which is an old population of Somali migrants who came there as sailors from the mid-19th century onwards, and they had children and they're still there. So they've been in the UK for a long time. And their situation is one of being an island in a very hostile, monocultural world, which has been pushing them out as much as possible. My interest, I guess, from oral history is a historical one. I think it helps us understand a lot of unseen histories that we don't know about. And I think some of the individual stories, there's a fantastic book by Susan Faludi, an American feminist writer, and her father was a refugee from Hungary just after the Second World War. And she didn't know a lot about his family because he was too traumatized really to talk and was quite a brutal, very patriarchal figure in their lives. And then after attacking their mother's boyfriend, stabbing him almost to death, he fled and they lost contact, and he resumed contact in his 70s after having a sex change in Thailand. And he had gone back to Hungary to live. So their family story is a very particular one, but also quite a general one of what happened to Hungary's Jewish population. And it's almost a moral tale of a community wanting to assimilate as much as possible, changing religion, changing names, being very successful, giving a lot back to the state in every way, and still not being accepted, still being treated abominably. And the Somalis, I think, have been very resistant to changing themselves too much when they migrate, and even becoming stronger in their religious observance and stronger in their cultural norms. So you have these very different approaches to being a foreigner, being the other, and they seem to add up to the same situation of still you're reviled, you're not accepted, you're continually the other. So through these small stories, I guess, of agency, of people trying lots of different tactics to acclimatize and to change themselves in whatever way, in whatever direction, it makes you ask yourself, well, what is the answer? And I haven't stumbled across the answer yet.
Maybe on this note we can show another clip. Can I ask the guys upstairs to show the clip? Hello? No?
No, they're just talking amongst
Yeah, guys in the regia, can we show the clip?
Jag är trött. Jag är trött på att missa mitt liv på grund av att jag måste bevisa vem jag är.
Jag är trött på att behöva vara övertydlig så att jag inte blir missuppfattad.
Jag är trött på att läsa avslag efter avslag.
Trött på att inte våga gå nära spåret ifall någon skulle putta mig framför tunnelbanan.
Jag är trött. Jag är trött.
Thank you. This is one of the videos that were created within the Displaced in Media project. And I was wondering, Ismail and NADIFA, you have your own experience of being, in your case, Ismail, literally displaced. So you were born in Somalia and you left it when you were a child. And in NADIFA's case, it's not your own experience, but the experience of your family, because you were born in the UK.
No, I was born in Somalia
as
well.
Okay, so you have the same experience then. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry for my mistake, but I was wondering what a personal experience of displacement or of migration or of a change of a place has taught you. Has it taught you to decipher or decode or empathize with the people's stories differently? Has it taught you to? Has it changed your perspective on their stories or on their
of the stories of other immigrants, refugees?
Exactly.
I'll answer first because I have it. As I get older, I'm thinking more about that displacement. I think when you're young, you're just going ahead, and there's not much time to work out what's going on, and you're surrounded by a new environment, and you just have to learn as much as you can and get by. And it's only as I get older that I'm starting to ask myself, well, what was the cost of that displacement for myself, for my family, in broader ways? And it's a heavy cost, and it's no surprise that being an immigrant is one of the risk factors for really serious mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. I remember growing up and in the early 90s when there was a big influx of Somali refugees into the UK, many people becoming very ill, developing mental health issues very early on, and suicides, other issues. And the tax of it was they've left somewhere that was very dangerous, openly dangerous, but the trauma of actually having to be an other in a new place with no money, no social network, was so difficult that some people couldn't cope with it at all. But other people could cope with it in the moment, but that trauma resonated throughout their lives and their children's lives. So I think it's actually a very heavy burden to carry and a heavy psychological thing to assimilate into the rest of your life, however comfortable or straightforward the rest of your life has been. And I also noticed myself, I think, feeling more strongly about things that have happened to my nieces who are young and who were born in the UK than things that have happened to me. So observing the way that they have been othered, disrespected in the street or in schools from a very young age has panicked me, because you want to protect them, I think, more than you want to protect yourself. And I don't know, they're too young to really have a take on it yet, but it'll be interesting to see what they develop their thoughts on. And one of them has already become very interested and invested in being Somali and being very Muslim and kind of rejecting this world that she sees as quite hostile.
Thank you, NADIFA. Actually, I might just start by reading a quote from the collection from NADIFA. It's very short. She says, quote, NADIFA, I still feel like I'm explaining. My family have been in the UK since 1947, and I still feel that I am marginal, that my grip on society is still very tenuous. And I think that's a good place to begin my sort of answer to your question. And I think what NADIFA was saying about the histories of this matters, because we are doomed to fail because we are repeating histories of migration and of people moving borders in the context of the UK because of situations often which the UK played a very key role in. For example, it's not a coincidence that migrants who arrive from Libya, which today, by the way, experienced quite a devastating attack on a detention centre holding migrants there, a number of people dead. But Libya is the transit country into Europe for migrants, but Italy was the colonial power in Libya. Eni, the Italian oil company, still has a role there, and businesses. People come from Eritrea and Somalia, which were former Italian colonies. So these histories are really important for us to think about the present reality. When it comes to to how does being displaced and feeling that experience play into my work? Well, I mean, as I said, obviously I cover these kind of stories of people on the move across Europe and elsewhere. So that plays a level in terms of the interest I have. But also on a personal level, I guess what's really interesting for me being in Sarajevo, I wanted to come to Sarajevo, by the way, for a very long time, because when I came to the UK, in '94, a lot of the people that I lived in a refugee shelter in Camden in London, and a lot of the people that were in the shelter were from Bosnia. And it was really interesting because my aunt who raised me would say, oh my God, they're very nice people, but they drink alcohol and they're Muslim. So it was this really strange kind of experience that we had, of being with people who were refugee from Kurdistan, they were from Bosnia, they were from lots of other places, and that experience of being displaced, I find it really interesting because I've also, like NADIFA, been thinking about this a lot more since I've got older, and a lot more recently because the last few months I've been based in East Africa, in Addis Ababa, and I spent a lot of time as a child in Ethiopia, and in the eastern part of Ethiopia there was a camp, there was a refugee camp, which was the largest refugee camp in the world, actually until it closed, and I grew up there for some of my youth, childhood, and I went back there, and now it's interesting, you go back somewhere thinking you'd have some kind of discovery, and I'm still processing it because it was only a few weeks ago, but actually it was really interesting to go back and to kind of see things that I vaguely remember, but also just to see how things go on, and there was like no monument, there was no, it was really beautiful. I went there through the rainy season, so this refugee camp, which I remember running around, and there were these sort of bulls or traditional huts that people had constructed if they could. There was the UN, the World Food Programme. There was a lot of dust. I just remember the dust. And I turned up and it was beautiful. My God, it was all green and there were camels camels everywhere. It was really lovely, and it was just so interesting to go back to somewhere which is so traumatic for me, clearly, but then being so beautiful. And it makes me think about, just come to the end of, but about what it means to be at home, what it means to belong. And it's really interesting, in the conversation between Sasha and NADIFA, where Sasha talks about at the end, and it says, he's white, he's a male, he can fit into society in a different kind of way, but he still feels like he's not at home in the US. And he was sort of saying, well, imagine what it's like for somebody arriving from Guatemala today, or somebody arriving from an African country. And I think it's interesting that, you mentioned the Somalis who are in Cardiff, in Tiger Bay, and they've been there for a very long time. So it's not like we arrived yesterday, all of us. But the reality is that I still feel displaced. And I guess being displaced is an aspect of my reality that maybe I'll always feel displaced on some level. And I think the society, not just in the UK, but across Europe, has become so much more hostile. But I don't know, maybe I've just woken up. Maybe it was always this hostile.
Antonia, in your essay, you are actually advocating for education. I mean, coming from Croatia, that has quite recently, just like Bosnia, had so many internally displaced people. We have the experience of being refugees ourselves, and we still lack the empathy for the new refugees. This lack of as if we just click like as if we turn off the button where you say, oh, I can't empathize with these people, even though you have that experience. But in your essay, you actually advocate for education, media education, that could, in a way, at least try to fix things. Can you tell us a bit more about that stance, or about that opinion that you have, or optimism that you have?
I was in Leeds 2 weeks ago, something like that, and I was really shocked by the amount of people who are homeless, deprived, on the margin. So the whole city is full of people who are out of society. And we were discussing how many layers of society had to fail in order to have someone on the street. You don't have one person or two people, but you have a huge amount of people that are out on the street, and they are mostly white, male, probably some kind of Christian, whatever, you know. What would be with the... So I think that people are developing resistance to... and to the sensitivity to the misfortunes of people. And when you come to the migrants, it's already like fifth step, because you left the ones that are your immediate circle. And that's why we are so much talking about empathy nowadays, because that's something that we have to learn again. Because otherwise, when you talk about something, then it's probably a huge or substantial lack of it, or over-the-top presence of it. And nowadays we are very much talking about empathy and solidarity and necessity to bring back to the community or whatever.
Because we don't have it.
Yes, because it's dissolving. And yeah, maybe we don't have to learn media literacy. Maybe we have to start learning the empathy, and then
how to be human.
Yeah.
I was wondering if the audience want to contribute or has any questions for our guests, or comments. Yeah, please. Maybe I can. Yeah. Oh, okay. There is a microphone.
It's much more working, but it's much more comfortable.
This one is working.
Speak without microphone.
Yeah, but we are recording.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very inspiring and interesting presentations. I'm wondering, our guests from the UK and Somalia, their personal opinion, to what extent this refugee crisis brought Brexit and votes for Brexit. And the second question would be for NADIFA, about your digging into the past and all that burden of the past, going into that. What do you think about, to me somehow it looks that you gain a depth of your writing from going into these kind of labyrinths and life situations where sometimes you just exist on the borders. And we know from some philosophers that these borders actually bring you real ontological meaning of life. So how would you reflect on these questions?
Thank you. I'll answer your first question first about Brexit. And I think it had a huge impact. But it was already, there was a lot already under the water, and then this became the thing that you could see above the water. And I don't know if you would be aware, he's a horrible man, but Nigel Farage used this image of Syrian refugees all flooding into the UK as one of the promotional materials for voting against the EU, voting to leave the EU. And the newspapers have done very similar things. I remember actually during the war in Bosnia seeing, of, I think it was in The Sun, this diagram of all of the millions of people that would be flooding from former Yugoslavia to the UK. So it's British fear of being invaded as an island by militaries or by individuals they don't care. It's all the same thing. So it tapped into a national nerve, and I guess some of the scenes of people camping out in the city centres and you know, huge amounts of people in train stations, that all contributed to this feeling of it being fevered and out of control and dangerous. I use oral history, I guess, as a way of contextualizing images like that. because it's not the first time that it's happened. And even London, which is, you know, this big global rich city, was somewhere that in 1945 had huge numbers of internally displaced people. That had people that, my area where I grew up, which is this quiet, small part of southwest London, was in a way formed by refugees. It was formed by the communities of East London who had lost their homes during the Blitz and needed somewhere new to live. And the post-war state developed these big estates with very idealistic utopian goals behind them. And they were decanted from East London to Southwest London and given gardens and houses with plumbing and central heating and balconies and all of these things. It was very idealistic. And I like thinking about London as this war-torn city. And you can go to the archives near my house and see exactly which bomb fell where, and this kind of, it's a governmental history. I think the social history in the UK of the war has become so crude and so utilized as one of this lone island, this great island which defeated Hitler single-handedly. But the other history of what it was like for ordinary people, what it was like to deal with this crime wave that happened during the 1940s, during the Blitz, what happened to these people who had to decamp to a new part of the country or the city, that to me is interesting. And it's also interesting to me in a Somali context where it's very different to Bosnia, where there's very little recorded. It's something I discussed with Sasha in the piece, where coming here last year for Bookstan was quite a shocking experience, because I went to the Museum of Genocide, which had an exhibition about Srebrenica, and I thought, oh, hold on a second. My family experienced very similar things to this. When I went to the museum, there was a father with 2 sons, and they were looking at this list of names of people who had died there, and they were pointing out a few names and posing with it, so it must have been someone related to them. And it gave me chills observing that, because in my family, everything to do with the war is very suppressed. It's too upsetting to talk about, don't talk about it. And that's on a much more grander level in Somaliland itself. There's one kind of monument in the city centre, but there's no museums, people don't talk about it, they build over everything, cemetery, they'll build over it, everything is just kind of like looking ahead, don't look back, you'll be turned to stone. But I think one of the things that you can see is lots of mental health issues. That's how it's exhibited. Post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, depression, everything. And I think the two things are connected. And I don't know what the mental health situation is in Bosnia, where maybe there is more space to talk about it. But I feel in my gut that Somaliland's lack of ability to do that is something which is coming out in these psychopathological ways.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think that's, is this on? Yeah, I think that's true. If you go to Somaliland or Somali regions, indeed, actually, if you go to other African countries, there is a lack of dealing with these recent traumatic, often brutal histories. And actually, just related to what NADIFA was saying, there's one particular story that I've been obsessed with, that I've been working on for some time, which is what the UN has actually officially termed genocide, but there's a big political disagreement about that term itself. But in regards to what happened to Somaliland under the last Somali leader, Said Barre, in the 80s, in which estimates suggest up to 200,000 people, no one really knows, could have been murdered systematically over the course of a number of years from the late 1980s. And I did the story investigating these mass graves and talking to people who experienced that, and also spending time in Somaliland itself. And what's interesting is that there's a whole new generation of people. One of our mutual friends, Musa Jama, who runs Hargeisa Cultural Centre, actually emailed me and told me that after this article that a lot of young kids were reading it and they completely didn't know anything about it. That's also because in that society, the majority of the population are under 25. So the people, maybe don't remember because of that, but also because the history has been lost. And I think it's the other point that NADIFA was talking about, not just about these histories being lost, but also talking very much about how history plays a very significant role presently. I mean, like, the whole Brexit debacle is really one of history is the fact that Britain, I would say, and a lot of people have said this, has not dealt with the history of empire, and has not dealt with the history of the war, has not dealt with what happened after the colonial, possessions were gone, and the people who are arguing for this hard Brexit, Boris Johnson, who is going to become the next Prime Minister, has made some outrageous statements over the years, too many to name, but people like him and the ones around him, really hold on to this particular reading of British history, which is actually, in a way, for me, since Brexit happened, has made me feel more displaced than I've ever felt living in the UK, to such an extent that I'm thinking, I don't know if I can really be in this place going forward. So yeah.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm very glad to be here, first of all, because by occasion I was invited yesterday, and I'm not even from here, and it's a very lovely and complete intellectual conversation, which I really appreciate. So I wanted to ask you a question. I don't know, any one of you can answer. I don't want to address to somebody in particular. Since we are talking about the refugee crisis or migrants, I know many occasions, especially in Germany, Austria, or even in England, where these countries are really willing to welcome and to make all the conditions that the refugees can adapt to the system, to the school, to the education system, to the society, but a part of them are refusing to integrate, to attend school, or to. So you are telling one side of the coin, and I'm telling the other, I guess. First of all, what do you think of that? Or in the UK, I'm not like, and I have a second one. For the British guests, let's say. What is the feeling on common people, common British people, for the Commonwealth Agreement as we speak?
Okay, I'll answer the first. I don't know if I believe that. I don't think that there's a failure to adapt. It depends what you call adapting. And lots of people believe that people from immigrant backgrounds don't follow the law, don't follow the customs, they don't have British values. That's something that the schools are meant to be teaching. But I am someone who's adapted, and I've adapted well according to all of the things, the markers that they would measure it by. But still, I walk into a shop, and there's suddenly this weird energy that I might be someone who's come to shoplift and steal from the shop. How do I adapt around that? How do I adapt the understanding of why I'm 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police? There's definitely a limit to how much you can adapt when you're in a situation where you're not wanted in the first place. And as I was saying, that the history of migration in the UK has been one of, we'll let you in, but we don't want you. Or we only want you in a certain frame at a certain time, and then you have to leave. So it's very difficult for children who are born into that situation to understand where they fit into this. They want to be British. They are British. I go back to Somaliland now, and that's also a foreign country to me. I don't just seamlessly adapt to life in Somaliland, and there's sometimes even more of a culture clash when I go there. So I think it's a get-out clause for people who are uncomfortable with immigration as a whole to justify that.
Yeah, and just to add, for example, let's just reference Denmark, what's happening in Denmark at the moment. Denmark has a policy which could, I have to say, can be lifted straight out of what the Nazis did. They have a ghettoization policy where if a certain neighborhood within, say, Copenhagen meets a certain threshold for having non-Danish or non-Danes, as they determine, population, they can come under the state's control. At one point in the Danish parliament, the debate amongst parliamentarians went so extreme that they were suggesting they put ankle bracelets, electronic bracelets, on young teens from that neighborhood.
And can I just add, also, if you committed a crime for one of those designated areas, you would be given a harsher sentence in any kind of criminal action.
So this is happening in Europe, and this is a reality. And the second brief thing to say is, in the UK context and elsewhere, we know, for example, that this is also about discrimination. It's also about race and racism and violence and state violence. And we also know that in the UK context, at least in London, that not only are you more likely to be stopped and searched if you're someone of black origin, but if you're a young Muslim, we know that if you commit a crime, you know, however heinous it is, you can lose your citizenship. And just brief example would be Shamima Begum, who was a young British Muslim. She was born in the UK, grew up in the UK. She's British, and she committed something that many consider heinous, and she should, if the evidence is there, obviously face the process of law on that. But she lost her citizenship, and what was really interesting to me was the person who ensured that she lost her British passport because she could not get another passport, was, you know, Sajid Javid, who is himself the first, you know, ethnic minority Home Secretary, Interior Minister in the UK. And he's obviously of Pakistani background himself. So the rhetoric is so corrosive to such an extent that somebody like him would be freely voting to erode his own rights. Because if you look at that example of Shamima Begum and her losing her citizenship because she joined ISIS, you may think, well, she deserves it, and it's a rather simple story, but it's not, because it concerns the rights of millions of people who are naturalized citizens. And that's the thing, these kind of changes that are happening in the UK and elsewhere seem like a perfectly reasonable response to a migration issue or integration issue, but actually it's just a red herring, because fundamentally it's about the state having this violent power over all of us, and that attacks all of our rights individually and collectively.
And she became the lightning rod of a lot of resentment, I think, across a much wider non-ISIS joining community, but she was the one who was guilty enough. She was unrepentant enough, and I think all of this hatred was aimed at her, to the point where she was refused to return to the UK, and her baby died. Her baby died in Syria.
If there are no more comments, or is there another question, or? Oh, you. Yeah, I just wanted to say if there are no, but if there is one, we can still accommodate one question and your answers.
Thank you. So my question concerns the difficulties of writing about trauma and about traumatic memory. And how do you do that without victimizing, you know, everyone who's been through conflict as also traumatized, or pathologizing them, but then also balancing that with the reality of the actual pathological situations that you've mentioned, but then the broad range where there's traumatic memory without necessarily PTSD or that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. How do you do that in a way that incorporates all this political history that you've been talking about, and that doesn't responsibilize individuals for their own mental health, which seems to be what happens in a neoliberal society, is that if you have a mental illness, it's your problem.
It's a really interesting question, and it's one I've been thinking about a lot as I'm thinking about writing about trauma, which follows you when you move to a new country and on a familial level. And actually, it's also a way into belonging to a particular place. So if you have a particular trauma, such as FGM, or just say with Malala Yousafzai, what happened to her, there's actually room for you then. You're an exemplary, suffering person who's been taken in and reformed, or is given a privileged position in that society as someone who makes the society feel better about themselves. So that exhibition of trauma is something that's really interesting to me, and it's something that I resist naturally. I don't want to be seen as someone who is a victim, is a survivor, or is anything like that. You know, my story is complicated, everyone's story is complicated, and that's not the term that I want acceptance on. But when it comes to other people's trauma and my ability to write about it, or my ability to even understand things that I've not experienced myself, then I'm both sympathetic, but I think you also have to take a slightly detached approach to it, where sadly trauma is not unique. It manifests in particular ways in different people, but the stories are so repetitive. And I was speaking to a researcher yesterday who works on what happened in Bosnia, and I asked her, so how do you deal with it? Because sometimes I can find it difficult to deal with. And she says you become numb to it. And I don't know if I want to reach that point of numbness, but it's also a way that you have to facilitate being able to write about it at all.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. I think that we can take this conversation out and continue talking about it, but there is another event and they're already waiting for us to leave. So, thank you.